Okay, this is the audio review for Study Guide Exam 2 for SOC 341. Alrighty, so first up, the idea of self as a social construction that takes place during interactions. That's basically the answer. So that's really all you need to know. All right, next one, social media. Just what we talked about in class, right? That social media is really an example of a mediated self, right? Because it's not something that we can just be ourselves in. We often filter ourselves, or kind of we see Facebook or Instagram or any of these other social medias as something that we have to navigate, right? So depending on who your friends are, like if your boss is your friend, if your professor's your friend, or sometimes just your family members, there's certain things you don't say or don't share, or certain photos you won't post because of that, right? So it's supposed to be us, but it's really not. It's really a mediated version. Let's see, ossification of cultural roles. Just the idea, Blumenstein said that certain roles become more solidified than others, right? Within our lives. And this has a lot to do with, how they're routinized and reinforced by people in our lives. Specifically how, especially if someone that's a significant other to you reinforces a cultural role, it's more likely to take hold, or solidify, or as he says, ossification, right? That takes place, kind of like the way he's making an analogy to how bones are healed, right? Okay, possible selves. Just the idea that being able to see yourself in a certain role is a very important aspect of being able to actually achieve that role. But it's not just about seeing yourself in the role, it's trying to imagine how you could get to that role, right? Like the specific process of how you get there is also important as to being able to attain that, right? So if you have a certain goal of a particular profession that you want to accomplish, right? If you have an idea of not just what you want, but how to get there, you're much more likely to make that happen. All right, moving on to self as a process of contradiction and conflict. Hegemonies, again, just the idea that hegemonies are the dominant positions in a society. So that means that because they're dominant, they're often just assumed to be normal. They're often unexamined, right? So they're kind of like the default positions in our culture. And it's whatever's the top of a hierarchy, right? So in a racial hierarchy, that would be whiteness. In a gender hierarchy, that would be cisgendered males. In a class hierarchy, that would be the wealthy or the middle class, right? So basically, the people that are at the top social positions in all of those hierarchies that we really want to be, right? We kind of desire to be in those positions ourselves because of the power and the positive representations we have of those people in the culture means that whether or not we agree with them, we know what those hegemonic positions are, right? All right, unmarked and marked. Just the idea that when a person is unmarked, they're just the default, right? They're part of the hegemony, right? So if you have an unmarked status, no one has to kind of qualify who you are. A marked status is one that's distinct from the norm, and you can tell in the way that it's made. So an example of that could be if you have to say male nurse, right? It's a marked status, male, in that case, because the assumption is that nurses are female, right? Or like, female pilot, right? The assumption being that pilot is male. But again, marked and unmarked status can also be seen in the fact that when we talk about racial identities, we don't talk about white Americans as much as we see them as Americans. And then we will call people African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, all these other groups instead of just American, right? Kind of go into that W.B. Du Bois stuff. But anyway, so, when you're marked, you have a position that's considered different, right? When you're unmarked, you're just kind of assumed to be normal. All right, so that has everything to do with hegemonies. Okay, so privilege, just that a consequence of privilege is a sense of social entitlement, right? And often this means that because when you're privileged, people don't challenge you, so you don't realize how hard it is for other people, right? Because you don't realize how free you are in your interactions with others, because you don't realize how much power you have to make your own definition of the situation the reality in an interaction. If you have a marked status or you're lower in a social hierarchy, you often have to deal with stereotypes against you or negative expectations of you. So there can be a lot of challenges to what you say and do or your definitions of the situation. So it takes a lot more interaction work to actually make that happen, to make your definition the point. So it makes sense that if you have a lot of privilege, you don't really see that reality. You think that everyone's life is as easy as yours is. And, if someone doesn't have something, you just think, well, why didn't they just do what I did? Right? Things like that, because you don't see how their situation is different. All right. Marked positions and social awareness. Okay, so here I'm just talking about how kind of the opposite of having that privilege and social entitlement is really understanding more so, like having more social awareness. Because again, it takes more effort to project your definition of the situation. So this is going to affect the way that you see the social reality, right? Where it makes sense that if you're going to be challenged a lot, you're not going to develop the same kind of entitlement that someone with privilege would. And that, even in the smallest interactions, people can kind of challenge or, again, stereotype you or define you in ways that go against your own self-definition. So that means you're just going to be more aware of those hegemonies and cultural value systems than someone who is part of those unmarked statuses. All right, internal attribution versus external attribution. So internal attribution is when you think that something is the result of something you did, while external attribution is when you say an outcome is due to something outside of yourself. So we talked about this in class in regards to, if you do well on this exam, right? Or if you don't, you could say, internal attribution would be, well, I studied, so I did well on the exam. And an external attribution could be, my professor's a jerk, and that's why I didn't do well, right? Something like that. Subjective freedom is basically just, whether or not you have any power to convey, like when you're interacting with people, if you can control the definition of the situation, that is subjective freedom. All right, moving on to looking glass self. So the 3 elements of the looking glass self, I'm just looking for those: the way that we imagine our appearance to others, how we imagine their judgments of our appearance, and how we develop either, feelings as a response to those judgments, either pride or mortification. When it comes to imagined judgment, this is essential because basically this is how we determine that inner sense of how we see ourselves based on how others see us, that imagined judgment. All right, theory of genius. Basically, Chef talked about all of those characteristics that differentiate language instruction from other types of instruction. So I'm going to give you a few of the 5 examples, so look for that. So some of those are just the fact that language is taught to you by someone you care about and love, right? Like your parents. So you might be more motivated to learn. That exposure to language begins at birth and happens your entire life. That it's a pretty interactive process, right? And that it really has to do with how a baby spontaneously makes a gesture or makes a noise, and the response it gets to it. That positive, gleeful response it gets from the parents has a lot to do with encouraging the child to continue to develop language, right? And also another big part of it is the fact that the people that are teaching you language are so much more knowledgeable about it than you are. So you're learning from someone that's basically an expert. All right, so shame as painful and ubiquitous. Just the idea that shame is very important to us in motivating a lot of our actions, and it can be extremely painful because it feels like a social death, right? It feels like the death of your internalized sense of self when you're very shamed. And it's ubiquitous, meaning it takes on many forms, and it can be somewhat insidious, like sometimes ways that we don't even realize that we feel shame, right? It takes on a lot of different forms. And really that just that it's kind of all around us and it happens all the time. All right, and when it comes to unacknowledged shame, the fact that there's 2 forms of that, bypass shame and overt undifferentiated shame, right? Bypass shame being that shame you push down real hard and you just try and ignore it. And he argues that this means that you spend too much time thinking about it, but not much time feeling it. And then there's the overt undifferentiated shame, where people just feel bad, right? Which he says is too little thinking and too much feeling, right? A feeling trap is just an emotional state that it's basically like a spiral that you fall into, right? Where you have a negative feeling and then you react negatively to that, and then you react negatively to that, and then to that, and to that, and to that, and on and on and on and on forever, right? And so escaping a feeling trap, the most effective way to do that, at least the author argues, is by having a good-natured laugh at yourself. So, when something shameful happens, being able to laugh. So the example I gave was how I remember one time I was walking to class. I was very late and I was pissed off and just, when you're trying to like run to class and be late, as a student, mind you. And I basically just slipped, fell, and just ate it on the concrete, like face first, like real bad, like skin up my legs, my hand. It was bad. And then I looked down and realized I slipped on a banana peel, which was just too ridiculous to not be hilarious. And I laughed really hard, right? And other people saw what happened, and then they were kind of like laughing with me. And that's part of what he talks about escaping a feeling trap, that if you can have a good-natured laugh at yourself in those situations where you would otherwise feel shame, like tripping and falling in front of people is super embarrassing, right? So it's something you would definitely feel shame about. So the fact that I did that, but then I saw the banana peel and just realized that was like objectively hilarious, meant that I laughed it off right away, and then it didn't lead to a feeling trap. Like I didn't feel ashamed and think like, oh, those people thought I was so stupid, I fell, and now they all hate me, or like whatever it is, like these kind of the way that feeling traps devolve, right? All right, moving on to identity careers of older gay men and lesbians. Just that C. Wright Mills talks about how biographical narratives are reflected in ideas and values of the time period that they come from, right? Just basically his whole idea that it's not enough to look at the social institutions in a society and understand their social history, and it's not enough to look at an individual's biography, but it's by looking at both of these things and understanding the context that someone's specific experiences are going to be settled into the historical context and of course the culture they come out of, right? So basically the social construction of homosexuality, what I'm looking for there is the social construction before gay liberation, right? Where being a homosexual was considered a disease, like a literal malady that could be cured, right? And it was often considered a psychological disorder, like literally it was in the DSM until the 70s. And as a consequence of this, people would get electroshock therapy. There was even a few cases of people being lobotomized. There's medical things. There's a lot of, just basically revulsion towards the category of homosexuals. This idea that it was a sexual perversion, someone that's just extremely stigmatized, right? That somehow is, and the way that they characterized homosexuality was about preying upon children, conflating homosexuality and pedophilia, right? All right, let's see. Distancing. In the article, Identity Careers of Older Gay Men and Lesbians, the author says that there were certain ways that people tried to resist that label of homosexuality. So he called that distancing, right? Where people would try to push back against those understandings of homosexuality that were so negative, that social construction of being like a disease or a mental disorder or perversion, right? And so people would do that by either, modifying or weakening or resisting the label of homosexual in applying it to themselves. When it came to coming out for family member or to family members, for those people that came of age before gay liberation, they did not come out to their family, right? This was like the only way you could still have a family and family relationships was by never telling them. But for people that came of age during or after gay liberation, coming out to family members becomes an essential part of having a close relationship to them. All right, moving on to double consciousness and the veil. All right, so double consciousness, just W.B. Du Bois' concept that, being an African American at the time of Reconstruction era, but of course it's still unfortunately very relevant today, is that you experience the culture through the hegemonic view and then through your subvertive view. So meaning you see the white ideals of the culture, but you also see your own human experience. So this means that you have like what he called two warring ideals in one body, right? You have the ideals of yourself and your self-concept that you're a human person that has dignity and should deserve respect. But then you also have the dominant idea in the culture that sees you as negative, as less than human, right? And that obviously affects the way that you end up seeing yourself. All right. Slavery as the sum of all villainies, the cause of all sorrow, and the roots of all prejudice. All I'm saying there is that basically in the reading, W.B. Du Bois talked about how the system of slavery was so horribly inhumane and cruel that people couldn't consider that by ending it, there would still be racism in the same form. That the social position of African Americans didn't change that much for a lot of years, right? And largely that's because as much as the racial caste system of slavery ended, the racial hierarchy of white supremacy did not, and the racial understandings of people of color as inferior to whites did not change. So there were just different, basically racism didn't end, it just changed. And people thought that by emancipating themselves, they would gain freedom and they would gain the rights and liberty and opportunities that others had. It wasn't something that people really thought, oh no, this is just the beginning of a constant struggle, right? Okay, so the idea of facing so vast a prejudice, just that if the culture hates you and has nothing but contempt for you, how then can you see yourself as human? Right? And this is like, when he talks about the culture, he talks about how, our notions of whiteness, or, he doesn't say specifically white supremacy, but that's really the way I'm contextualizing it, that our notions of whiteness as rational over irrational, as whiteness as, civilized over, uncivilized, like these kind of weird dualities that are created in the narrative of the culture reinforce that the positive aspects of those dichotomies could be attributed to whites, while the negative aspects of those dichotomies can be attributed to blacks. And this is just a further way to dichotomize and try to act as if they are somehow opposite extremes, instead of seeing it as like, well, humans are humans, right? And so basically he says that, when you're facing all that prejudice, everyone hates you and thinks that you should just be a servant and be happy being a servant, that's going to affect the way you see yourself, and it might make you have actually contempt and hate for yourself. All right, moving on to Goffman. Meaning is negotiated through interaction. Okay, so yeah. Or I guess this is just the Jody O'Brien one. Whatever. Okay. Interaction work. So just the idea that we are all socialized to have certain ideas about how we're supposed to act in certain situations. So Goffman since in his dramaturgical perspective, he calls these scripts, right? That we have these social scripts. And that since we memorize all of these social scripts, when we interact with each other, it seems kind of automatic, right? It's that interaction work. Embarrassment is just something that is a breakdown in a interaction, that it's just really when your projected identity isn't what other people see you as, right? So like this could be being the butt of a practical joke. Like you think, you're presenting yourself as one way, but then people are laughing at you. That can cause embarrassment, and it affects the identity that you're trying to put out, that you're competent or whatever it is that you're trying to project as your definition of the situation. To negotiate a working consensus is just to work with people. Whenever we interact, people are going to have their own interpretations of things, right? So it's important that you're able to translate your definitions so that other people can understand you and accept what you're saying as the definition of the situation. And then interaction routines. This is just, again, the fact that since we have routinized certain aspects of interaction, that we often take for granted a lot of the cultural patterns that are being passed on when we interact with each other. And we also often let people perform the identities that they want to claim and their definition of the situation. So it's really through these interactions that we try to set, our standard of what's expected of us. Okay, moving on to presentation of self in everyday life, selections, Goffman. Okay, so expressions given versus expressions given off. So expressions given are those verbal communication, basically, like talking, words, those things. Expressions given off could be a lot of different things, but basically something that's considered specific to the person saying it, right? So like if you're like, how are you doing today? And I'm like, oh, I'm doing fine. Or if you're like, how are you doing today? And I'm like, doing fine. And I roll my eyes or I sigh, right? Obviously the verbal symbols I'm using are the same, but the tone, the expression on my face, the rolling of my eyes, a sigh, are those expressions given off. Other actions that are kind of interpreted as well to be a reflection of what the person's actually saying. All right, veneer of consensus is just when basically people will often conceal their own wants behind kind of like platitudes that they give each other. Like, oh, I just really want to make sure we hash this out and have a, agreement about something, even though they really don't want to agree with this person. This often happens in, especially like work environments. There's a lot of times you kind of have to like, not necessarily suck up to someone, but just kind of like pay lip service to their ideas or their, their definitions of the situation. And this is really because as we interact, interactions can actually kind of break down pretty quickly. So it's important that we have temporary, often, definitions of the situation. And so this veneer of consensus is just a very thin veneer where we might have an agreement on something, but that doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way, right? Like I might say like, oh, sure, that's a great idea. And then as soon as you leave the room, I'm like, that's a terrible idea. Right? Okay, defensive and protective practices, just that these are the techniques that we use to try to protect our impressions that we give when we're interacting with other people. So we also, we basically want to protect ourself or our self-identity, and we want to make sure that that we are presenting ourselves in a way that has that idealization, right? Where we're presenting the ideal form of ourselves. So oftentimes people will use protective and defensive strategies to make sure that people see them the way they want to be seen. All right. Front, according to Goffman, in his whole dramaturgical thing, is where you perform for an audience. And it also includes the props and the stage and the set and all that kind of stuff. Your specific actions, your mannerisms, all the things that go into the performance itself. While backstage is where you prepare for the performance, right? This includes whatever tools you use, whatever props you use, and really just, a place for working to develop that sense of what's going to be performed on the front. All right, establishing the scene in steampunk live action role play. So, steampunk, what the hell is it? Right? Well, basically the way it's described in the reading is basically like a pastime for people, right? Like a thing that they can hang out and do that involves playing with history and time, right? Where typically people will imagine a alternate, well, it's not even future because it's often current history, but one that stems from changes in the past that never led to a digital age, right? So they still have like steam power and a lot of the other mechanical and kind of like what we wouldn't necessarily call technological advancements of the 19th century. But somehow because of a change in history or, the kind of butterfly effect, I guess, of just you change a couple things in history and it changes the entire outcome of civilization, that they never developed the kind of digital technology that we have today. So the way that people bring steampunk together is often by understanding the fashion and materials and technology and, just kind of what the world was in the 19th century. And they creatively kind of pick and choose parts of that reality to recreate as an interactional context that they can play within, right? So they, it's not as if all steampunk is LARPing, right? LARP is more of just actually performing something into reality versus steampunk itself is not just a LARP activity. It's also, there's steampunk music, there's steampunk art, there's actual, one I would definitely recommend if you were like, what the hell is steampunk? And I'm interested. Scott Westerfield, great author, teen, young adult author, who's written a couple of really great series, put out a whole steampunk series, which I would highly recommend if you're interested in any of that. But anywho, so it's basically, it doesn't have to just be LARPing. There's a lot of other creative expressions of, it's just kind of like a different understanding of reality, right? And some of those people conceptualize steampunk as very like utopian, while other people conceptualize it as dystopian, right? Like a bad or, a negative future. Okay, so LARP, again, why does it work? Because people have shared meanings. That's all that is, right? That, I think I gave you the example of how my boyfriend and I were riding bikes through the park when we stumbled upon a bunch of people LARPing. And for us, we didn't know what the hell was happening because we didn't have the shared meanings that they had. We didn't understand, like, who was in charge, what were the certain roles they were doing, how tennis balls were probably supposed to represent something more mystical than tennis balls. So it's really through the shared meaning that people are able to create a social world that's a different reality. And this is why he calls it a serious work of play. Just that, reality itself is elastic. So it's something that we can create realities with our imaginations, just as long as we have other people that can understand the social realities that we're creating. And since this is such a complicated thing, like he calls it a serious work of play as well, because the Rise of Aster, the one he's referring to in this LARP situation, has a 500-page manual that you have to read just to be able to participate in this hobby people have, right? So obviously it's a very serious work of play because you have to understand not just the social script of what you're supposed to be saying within the context of the game, but also like what the context is of the social world that you're encountering. So the reason he thinks this is important is because it gives us a little bit of an insight into how we are actually structuring and creating our realities all the time. All right, and then moving on to Death as Theater. Okay, so funeral directors as a business. Just the business aspect of like, you can't drum up profits by like killing people or putting stuff in the water or anything. So the only way that you can really create more business for yourself as a funeral director is making sure that, you have a good impression of you so that people are going to use your business. And if you have a favorable impression from the people that come in and have funerals at your funeral home, this can mean that you get more than your share of the business in the community. And then the only other way that you can actually do this is to just raise prices. Right? That's the only way you can actually increase any money in your business as a funeral director. Role distance, just that obviously the role of being a mortician, or what used to be called an undertaker, is pretty upsetting to most people. So funeral directors often engage in role distance in some manner to separate themselves from what we consider the gross or just, really upsetting work of preparing a corpse for funeral or for burial, right? So sometimes he'll do this by basically doing his directing work very separately from his body work. So this could be wearing different outfits or maybe hiring a mortician. And obviously, when people are working in the backstage setting, preparing a body for burial, they are, really trying to distance themselves emotionally from the dead body by often like joking or listening to music or doing something else, so that they can try to kind of conceptualize for themselves that this is just a normal job like anything else, right? They're just working. They're not carving open a body and draining it of all blood, right? Which is actually exactly what they're doing. All right, backstage setting. So just that all I'm looking for there really is just that the backstage setting itself is where they're actually doing like the preparation of the body. And most people are really grossed out by that, so they're not going to walk back there, right? Even if you did just leave it wide open, they're not going to want to go back there and see what's happening in there. But there's still an effort to preserve the backstage setting as backstage. So sometimes there'll be like employees only signs or curtains or doors or just some sort of physical barrier that separates the backstage setting of, carving up a body, from the presentation of this person as like a venerated, respected person that happens during the funeral in the front stage. So, and again, often it's spatially segregated, just meaning it's kind of like separate and around, the way from where the actual, from other parts of the funeral home. But it has to be close enough that the funeral director can still kind of do the backstage and the front stage during a funeral to make sure that everything is kind of, all the moving pieces work out. And this really leads into the last question too. That's all about that, controlling the situation. So basically the author argues that the funeral director is a director, right? That using a play analogy, that there's a cast of characters in a funeral and that the director's directing them, right? The director's directing the star of the show, which is the dead person. They're directing all the family members that are upset and crying, that are often themselves judged for their performance, right? Like people will be like, oh, the family, they took it really hard, or, they held up really well, or things like that. So they're also kind of part of this performance. And of course, there's like the minister himself. There's all the people that are bringing in the body from the the pallbearers, or, you're going to have to like manage the people driving in, like if you have a funeral procession, or, people bringing flowers, or people dropping off, any of these kind of things, that it's a lot of stuff that he has to orchestrate so that everything goes smoothly and there's not any like problems or challenges to his projection of the definition of the situation of like a respectful event that honors the life of this person, right? Alrighty, so short answer essay questions. All right, I'll give you little hints here. So defining privilege and double consciousness. So I want to make sure in the first part of that that you actually do both of those things, right? When I grade these things, I'm really looking at making sure you answer each part of the question. So you want to define each, what privilege is, what double consciousness is, then compare and contrast how they're related to interactional contexts. And when I mean interactional context, I really just mean how do these things operate differently in social interactions, right? That's what I'm looking for there. So what's the difference between having privilege and double consciousness when it comes to how you engage with the world, right? Okay, for the second one, using death as theater as an inspiration, as he, uses a dramaturgical analysis to explain how funerals work. I want you to explain front stage and backstage in one of your own performances, right? So this could be at your own workplace. This could be for school. This could just be like, I don't know, you're a member of your, you play like pickup basketball with your friends. I don't know. This could literally be any performance that you do in your life. Just something that you perform for an audience in some way. So this could be, how you perform family expectations for your family, or how you perform religiosity in your church, or whatever it might be, right? How do you define the situation in your context, and how do you then work to project your definition of that situation? So, if you use death as theater as an inspiration, you can see how he really developed the difference between the front stage, the backstage. Remember, the backstage just being where and how you perform, or you prepare for your performance. So I want you to kind of think about that, about how you can apply that to some aspect of how you interact with others, right? All right, and that's it. Hopefully this is helpful.